On the 18th of October 1942, the heavens opened and pouring rain grounded the Luftwaffe, making the soldiers on both sides miserable. The ground turned to mud, hindering Chuikov's supply operations across the Volga and causing supply bottlenecks for Paulus's army at the Don. But there was no immediate rest for the forces inside Stalingrad. In the north of the city, Group Krumpen and the 267th Regiment of 94th Infantry Division failed again in the face of Group Gorokov. Gorokov still had over 4,000 men at this point, with over 100 machine guns and 57 anti-tank rifles, so it wasn't a weak force by any stretch of the imagination. Worse, for the Germans, ammunition and food was finally starting to trickle across the Volga via boats and cutters, meaning Gorokov could and would continue the fight. Knowing that the Germans would strike again, Krylov ordered Guriev to send spare units to the 193rd Rifle Division to help them fend off the Germans. These consisted of just 2 rifle companies, which were then reinforced by a motorised rifle battalion and the mobile tanks of 84th Tank Brigade. The Soviets had little left to throw into the line, so Zeilitz's forces struck once more. However, something unexpected happened. The Germans inside the Barricade factory found themselves being shot at from behind, as Ludnikov's troops appeared in areas the Germans believed they had already cleared. And these shots didn't come from the odd soldier or small trapped group of men. No, the Germans slowly realised to their astonishment that almost the entire northern part of the factory was actually in Soviet hands. The situation was so bad that some German companies were threatened with encirclement. And this came as a complete shock, and the German plan of attack was abandoned. Rather than advance, some German units actually had to withdraw. And even though at one point Ludnikov himself thought that his entire division was surrounded, that doesn't appear to be the case. The Soviet line, if you could call it that, held. The battleground was not a flat surface. This area was three-dimensional. Soviet soldiers could filter through below ground in sewers and conduits, or overhead on catwalks and gantries. Hidden from view by darkness and with the pelting rain masking all sounds, they infiltrated from the southeastern section into the northern part of the factory and effortlessly reoccupied buildings behind the German front line. The German infantry and panzer grenadiers were entangled with the Soviet rifle and guardsmen within the factory, to the point where single rooms, broken walls, and pieces of factory equipment became battlegrounds. All the while, the hail of artillery shells and rockets flying in from the other side of the Volga crashed around them. A nurse from the 347th Rifle Regiment, whose medical company hadn't been encircled with the rest of the regiment, recalled the situation inside the Barricade factory.
That evening, it turned out that we were surrounded. We spent the whole night and day at the Barricades factory, but we had no chance of leaving because there was nowhere to go. The enemy had set up machine guns all around, and they were even throwing grenades. The Germans had come within 5 meters of us. We used grenades just like the soldiers. That night, we decided to fight our way out of there.
Vasily Grossman was with the 308th Rifle Division at the time and also described the scene. The Germans managed to break into the factory. Their tanks roared along the workshops. They ripped up our defences, cutting off command posts from the troops. It seemed that the 308th Rifle Division, deprived of management, would lose the ability to resist, but something formidable happened. Each trench, each dugout, every foxhole and fortified ruins of houses turned into a fortress with its own command system, with its own communications. Sergeants and privates became commanders, skillfully and wisely repelling attacks, and in this bitter hour, commanders and staff officers turned their headquarters into defensive positions and themselves into ordinary soldiers fighting off enemy attacks. The regimental commander himself was firing a mortar. The 118th Guards Regiment, which was the remains of the 37th Guards Rifle Division, now numbering just 200 men, with support from the 650th Regiment of the 138th Rifle Division, fought to hold this area, halting the Germans with artillery fire. The Russians very skillfully held out on this Volga shore in gullies and in constructed bunker positions on the steep slope which could only be reached with steep fire weapons. As mentioned last time, Gertev's weak and ad hoc battle group was ordered to make an attempt to break through to their trapped comrades in the Skulpcherny Park pocket. They had no chance. Worse, shortly after noon, the Chief of Staff of the 193rd Rifle Division reported to Chuikov that 6 enemy tanks had broken through to the area of Skul 26, so Gertev's forces could barely hold the line, let alone attack. Thus, the remaining men inside the pockets were left to their fate. Inside the northern pocket, Soviet resistance fought on, often hand-to-hand, inflicting substantial casualties on the Germans, who were, again, blunted by Soviet artillery fire. Against the southern pocket centred around the ravine, the 276th Infantry Regiment advanced, with Hull's 2nd Battalion in the north and Richter's 3rd Battalion in the south. The first couple hundred metres were taken quickly, but Soviet machine guns then opened up. The 5 panzers in support from 24th Panzer Division did their best, but it was down to the infantry to engage the enemy in their foxholes. Soviet riflemen resisted stubbornly, with one commissar even turning a pistol on himself when cornered and asked to surrender. Despite this, most of the pocket was eliminated, with just some elements left in the Balka itself. The cost, though, had been heavy for the 276th Infantry Regiment. 5th, 6th and 7th Companies of my 2nd Battalion together have a combat strength of 23 men. 7 of those belong to 7th Company. 3rd Battalion has a total of 21 men in its rifle companies. I was dumbstruck and couldn't utter a word. What had become of our regiment? Where were the replacements? If no experienced and battle-hardened men arrived, what use was the framework of staff and supply units as well as units of heavy weapons? That evening, knowing that the pockets were about to be wiped out, the 24th Panzer Division ordered the 276th Infantry Regiment to fall back into reserve positions west of the stadium. Some of the Soviets, although not many, managed to get out before the southern pocket collapsed, joining the 161st Regiment or Ludnikov's 138th Rifle Division. The units in complete encirclement fought fierce battles all day and night on 17th and 18th of October. Not a single soldier and commander located in the full encirclement willfully abandoned his positions, and none spared his life fighting to destroy the fascists. Of these, only an insignificant group of people from 339th and 347th Rifle Regiments, who were sent out as messengers, remained alive. And, despite attempts to take it, the bread factory remained in Soviet hands, with the 161st Regiment of Gorishny's 95th Rifle Division clinging on desperately. Zeilitz's well-orchestrated assault quickly degenerated into a costly slugfest between attacking Germans and counter-attacking Soviets that would endure for several more days and produce only meagre German gains. Richthofen was again disgusted. His airmen had thrown everything they had at the enemy, he self-righteously claimed, yet the army failed to concentrate forces against single targets and advance with a sense of purpose. The OKW reported that the day had been successful, but it was clear that Seydlitz had failed to achieve his objectives. The barricaded factory was still not cleared of Soviet soldiers, and Ludnikov was sending in march battalions and small companies into the factory as well as ammunition to keep the battle going. Seydlitz's forces took 213 casualties on this day, which isn't many. However, we must remember that this came after a long period of sustained casualties, and so the effect was substantial. The 305th Infantry Division, for example, only reported 56 casualties for the 18th of October and a ration strength of 10,578, including Hiwis. Their combat strength, though, was just 3,345 men. Traub's 305th Pioneer Battalion had just 122 combat troops left, and only 3 of them were officers. Glantz therefore concludes, 6th Army had suffered 13,343 casualties since the 13th of September, bringing its total losses since crossing the Don River on the 21st of August to 40,068 officers and men. Although Paulus's army had captured 57,800 Red Army soldiers since the 21st of August, including 17,900 since the 13th of September, these losses were far lower compared to previous fighting. But the situation was still desperate for the Soviets, with Chuikov actually ordering a withdrawal to straighten out his lines. This was the first withdrawal he'd made in the battle. There was no reference to withdrawal in the order. In our orders, we could not and must not use words such as withdrawal or retreat, so that the other commanders would not think that they could withdraw to new positions with the approval of the army or front HQ. I remember with what bitterness I signed this order, how dear every yard of earth west of the Volga was to us. From its initial 1,067 men, the 650th Rifle Regiment was now down to just 86, and the 768th was at 424 men, and the 344th was at 577. So Ludnikov had paid the price for not establishing his line correctly. In addition to these units, a battalion-sized ad hoc force called the Kisilov Group, consisting of 300 anti-tank artillerymen without their anti-tank guns, was positioned to defend the Barricadi factory. And while the militia units inside the Barricadi factory had fought hard over the past few days, by this point just 5 men of the Barricadi militia remained alive, so we'll remove the units from the field of battle. We felt not only that our own ranks were thinning and our strength ebbing, but that the enemy could not go on indefinitely launching his insane attacks. They were being drowned in their own blood. The enemy's material resources were also being exhausted. The Luftwaffe's sorties had dropped from 3,000 to 1,000 a day. Chuikov then claimed that the Germans were pouring in fresh infantry and panzer units, but this wasn't true. The only unit moving into Stalingrad was Schwerin's 79th Infantry Division, but this wasn't fresh, and Paulus had already had this division in his roster, so it wasn't really reinforcements as such, more of a shifting of forces he already had. Schwerin's division was now split in two, with the 226th Infantry Regiment moving elsewhere, while the other 2 regiments were moving into the city area that evening. With this force, Paulus remained hopeful that the battle could be finished in the next 2 to 3 days. The next target for Zeilitz would be the bread factory and the Red October factory. Interestingly, despite what we've said in previous videos, Paulus now believed that Chuikov had kept his nerve. Arguably this wasn't the case, but Paulus believed it at the time. This might explain why, at midnight, when Shmekatorov himself informed Chuikov that the 685th Rifle Regiment and their training battalion were shattered, and that a gap had formed between the 685th and 895th Rifle Regiments, and Shmekatorov asked Chuikov to do something about this, Chuikov, though, and the 62nd Army's command didn't react that day or that night. Perhaps they had kept their cool or ignored the situation. Either way, Chuikov's men were not out of the woods yet, and time would tell if they would survive or not. Outside the city and further to the west, Romanian forces remained under attack, and since his lines were already stretched thin, Dumitrescu now point-blank refused to relieve any more Italian divisions. Clearly, tensions were heating up in the Axis camp, and the Don flank was looking increasingly exposed. Worse, a couple of days previously, Yeremenko had instructed Shumilov to begin preparations for a counterattack in his sector, due to begin on the 23rd. The plan was to break through 371st Infantry Division's defences and link up with 62nd Army at the Zaritsa River. Yeremenko hoped to draw at least 1 infantry and 1 panzer division away from Stalingrad, and Rokossovsky had been ordered to prepare another attack as well. Yes, a 4th Kotluban operation, because when at first you don't succeed, fail again. Rokossovsky's plan this time was to penetrate the German defences west of the Milch Farm and northwest of Kuzmichi, and advance towards Orlovka. He would use Malinovsky's 66th Army and a small force from 24th Army during a 5-day offensive between the 20th and 24th of October. but Stalin then demanded that the offensive begin a day earlier on the 19th, so it would. Now, to be fair, there had been some changes to the armies this time. 24th Army was now commanded by General Galanin, with Kozlov being appointed assistant commander of the Voronezh front. And Malinovsky's 66th Army had received 4 fresh rifle divisions: the 62nd, 252nd, 212th and 226th. It also had the 91st, 121st and 64th Tank Brigades, each with roughly 53 tanks. These fresh units would strike south, while the army's remaining 9 rifle divisions, now shells of their former selves, would conduct supporting attacks. 24th Army's main attack with 316th, 173rd and 233rd Rifle Divisions would support 66th Army's assaults, even though they were severely under strength. The 116th and 229th Rifle Divisions, supported by 8 tanks from the 58th Tank Brigade, and the 49th and 343rd Rifle Divisions with little or no tanks, would also attack south in support. Rokossovsky expected the attack to fail, and Malinovsky begged him not to waste the new divisions in combat. And sure enough, when the 4th Kotluban offensive began on the 19th of October 1942, the attacks quickly faltered. The Germans were well dug into their fortified positions, supported by artillery, and easily held off the 62nd Army's attack. Worse, the rain had given way to snow on the 19th, with the ground turning to mud. This was, in fact, the first snow to fall in the Stalingrad region this year, so it was bad timing for the Soviets. 6th Army's diary says that the roads were swamped and only passable for cross-country vehicles, suggesting that infantry would be in trouble if they were trying to advance in such conditions. Most of the sources, including 6th Army's diary, suggest that the Luftwaffe had been grounded because of the bad weather. But another source suggests that the Stukas were diverted from Stalingrad to the north to defend against Rokossovsky's attack, and 6th Army's diary does say that reconnaissance aircraft did manage to get up into the sky, as did Paulus's private plane. So maybe some Stukas managed to support the Germans, but either way, it was obvious that the Germans had the decisive advantage in their defensive positions. Rokossovsky's pessimism was justified. As in the past, Rokossovsky's mission was sacrificial, if not suicidal. The only success came from the 252nd Rifle Division, which did manage to capture Hill 130.7 by the end of the day, but the 316th Rifle Division only advanced 150 metres before being pinned down. The 173rd Rifle Division pushed 200 metres towards Hill 128.1, but again was hit by heavy German machine gun fire. The 233rd Rifle Division barely moved forward at all, and the 84th Rifle Division was actually counterattacked and lost a small amount of ground. Adding insult to injury, the OKW reported that the Soviets had launched diversionary attacks from the north, which were repulsed by our forces. The enemy suffered significant losses. Casualties for the Germans were basically non-existent, with 3rd Motorized Division reporting 2 men killed and 3 wounded. The 60th Motorized and 16th Panzer Divisions did lose more than that, but this was insignificant compared to the Soviets, whose numbers we'll come back to later, and overall, it was another disaster for the Red Army. Back inside the city though, the tide had finally turned for Paulus's 3rd offensive. The weather had disrupted the German supply lines, forcing Paulus to end his attack, and the only thing he could do now was consolidate the positions he had won and take the rest of the barricading factory and the bread factory, as he prepared for another offensive that he hoped would get his forces moving again once the weather permitted. This was easier said than done. Given the weakened state of 51st Corps, the combat regiments conducting Zeilitz's attack were able to muster little more than single battalion-sized Kampfgruppen with 1,500 to 2,000 men each, supported by roughly 10 tanks and assault guns. Heim's 14th Panzer Division was ordered to capture the bread factory, currently defended by the 161st Rifle Regiment, which was the remains of the 95th Rifle Division. Nearby, the 685th Rifle Regiment also offered resistance to Heim's forces, which is perhaps why they didn't get very far. Meanwhile, Oppenlinder's 305th Infantry Division with a squad of tanks from the 14th Panzer Division tried to clear the Soviets from the Barricade factory. 138th Rifle Division's 768th Regiment, as well as elements of the 344th Regiment and the 295th Artillery Regiment, put up stiff resistance in the northern and central halls. The Germans were pinned by machine gun, mortars and artillery fire, and were simply unable to advance. In the end, Oppenlinder called off further attacks, realising that the clearing of the halls inside the factory would be too difficult. Except, it may not have been Oppenlinder who stopped the attack. Having heard about the devastating losses that his division had suffered, Oppenlinder suffered a nervous breakdown. But rather than reporting this to the higher-ups, the division's chief of staff, Oberst Kodra, kept this quiet by simply taking control of the division on the general's behalf. It's not clear why he did this. Maybe he believed that Oppenlinder would recover quickly and thus didn't want him to have a black mark against his name. Either way, Kodra wasn't able to effectively command the division by himself, which is part of the reason why they found themselves pinned by the Soviet guns. One interesting thing to note though is that Paulus himself actually visited the 305th Infantry Division's command post on this day, recording this in the 6th Army's diary. 11:30. The commander arrives at the command post of 305th Infantry Division and listens to the reports of its commander. The fighting in the northern part of the gun factory in the division's sector has resumed. The total loss of the division since the 14th of October is almost 1,400 men. To me, this suggests that Oppenlinder was fine in the morning and then suffered his nervous breakdown later in the day. Alternatively, he had already suffered this breakdown but managed to act as if everything was alright in front of Paulus. Regardless, it's clear that one of the German divisions had a crisis of command and a loss of control in the centre of Stalingrad. Lenski's Panzer and Yenika's infantry divisions had been ordered to clear the Soviets from the western bank of the Volga between the Brick and the Barricade factories. The 650th and 118th Regiments would have resisted Kampfgruppe Bülow's assault, but it was never to be, as, thanks to Oppenlinder's failure and the supply situation, Seydlitz was forced to end the offensive. Then, to add insult to injury, Ludnikov ordered his forces to counterattack, and they managed to retake the few remaining northern parts of the factory that were still in German hands. The Germans managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Soviets and counterattacked, regaining some of the ground, but this had been a significant local victory for the Red Army. Seydlitz's corps had lost 186 men on the 19th, along with 22 and 7 tanks respectively in the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions. They were now down to just 11 and 22 tanks. There was a partial success in the north versus Group Gorokov, as 94th Infantry Division managed to move into Spartanovka and capture the city's prison, but Yeremenko commandeered the artillery from the 300th Rifle Division and used that to fire on the German concentrations, blunting the attack. Overall then, it had been a poor day for Paulus and marked the end of his third offensive inside the city. While the immediate situation was bad, there was still hope that Paulus could resume his attacks in the coming days. The 79th Infantry Division moved forward on the night of the 19th to the 20th, taking up positions on the 100th Jaegers Division's centre and left wing, with the 54th Jaeger Regiment transferring to Schwerin's command. It was hoped that the 79th Infantry Division might be able to get the momentum going again. But sadly for Paulus, this was not to be. As the 20th of October rolled in, the rain continued, mixed with light snow, preventing Seydlitz from continuing the attack. The soldiers would go on to nickname this period of the battle Operation Lull, and it would last for 3 days. Paulus used this opportunity to replenish and reorganise his forces, with the Germans only patrolling and conducting light reconnaissance on the 20th itself. Even so, Seydlitz lost another 147 men on this day, with the 79th Infantry Division suffering their first losses inside the city. By now, word of the command crisis in the 305th Infantry Division had reached the higher-ups, and Oppenlinder was relieved of his position and sent back to Germany. Oppenlinder's replacement was Oberst Hermann Barnbeck, who had commanded the 211th Infantry Regiment from the 71st Infantry Division. The division's chief of staff, Kodra, was also in trouble for not reporting the situation straight away, and so was also to be relieved as soon as a replacement was found for him. Divisional leadership was a team effort, a dual system of command, if you will, that required an inspirational leader to call the shots and a calculating staff officer to supply strategic guidance and convert his leader's orders into concise instructions. Kodra had assumed both roles during the gun factory battle, and as a result his impeccable record as chief of staff suffered, as did his health. That evening, Barnbeck issued orders that got the 305th Infantry Division back on its feet. He re-established both command and control by sorting out the division's communications. He also placed the units in the factory area under Brandt's leadership, meaning that the division was now finally better organised and led. Schwerin's division, meanwhile, was ordered for the next day to launch a limited attack to break through the Soviet lines and reach the railway line. He was assigned elements from the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions for this task, with the objective being the cooking factory, defended by 1st Battalion of the 685th Regiment of 93rd Rifle Division. On the opposite side of the wire, Soviet intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were concentrating around Hill 107.5. In other words, they had identified 79th Infantry Division's movements. So, Chuikov assumed that Seydlitz was about to launch a powerful thrust on the Red October factory. Before we get to that though, it's worth just quickly assessing the overall situation at the end of Pallas's third offensive. What we've just witnessed in the last couple of episodes was the final manoeuvre battle inside the city of Stalingrad. They had seized the tractor factory and a large portion of the northern city and had split the 62nd Army in two. But the Germans had suffered as well, and their strength was failing. Even with the two regiments from the 79th Infantry Division, from now on it would be a painful slog as the Germans attempted to clear the Soviets from their small strip of land on the edge of the Volga. Essentially, the battle had become a stalemate. This is reflected on the 21st of October when Schwerin's forces attacked. They did move forward slightly but suffered significant losses for the ground taken. The German infantry let the panzers get ahead of them, which then rolled into a minefield that the infantry had known about but hadn't cleared. The Soviets also held on stubbornly in most of their positions. Thus, in Weber's regiment alone, 20 men were killed, another 131 were wounded, and 8 went missing, plus 7 of the 10 panzers deployed were knocked out, including the panzer commander Schulte. The Soviets then launched a counterattack, retaking most of the ground lost. So yes, another complete failure for the Germans. Inside the barricaded factory, the 305th Infantry Division took most of Hall 6A before stalling in Hall 4. Then the Soviet counterattack went in that evening, meaning that the day's gains were wiped out. The intensity of the fighting caused another German officer, this time a major, to just get up and wander off, muttering to himself as he left. He was then grabbed by the other men and was evacuated from Stalingrad, surviving the war. So yes, the division's commander had suffered a breakdown, and now other officers were as well. Morale seemed to have been strained on the German side, as were their logistics. 51st Army Corps reports that the offensive in Stalingrad cannot be continued because of a shortage of ammunition. The Chief of Staff of the Army immediately sends a corresponding request to the Army Rear Department. There is little ammunition in the troops because the Russian artillery remains active. The offensive is postponed to a time when the weather will make it possible to fully use aviation. To stop any other chance of the Germans breaking through, Chuikov also moved up a battalion from the 1043rd Rifle Regiment and ordered the Army's flamethrower company to protect the landing stage. The 1st blocking detachment was also sent into the line. In essence, his formations were no longer operating as divisions but were a mixture of small units from all over the place cobbled together to form a line. Chuikov's flexible employment of reserves, drawn from every conceivable sector, whether single companies or entire battalions, literally checkmated all of Pallas's and Seydlitz's local attacks. Anton Jolly's Stalingrad Battle Atlas series lists the number of troops on both sides at this point, and inside the city, Paulus had a ration strength of approximately 66,000 men, supported by 70 tanks and Stugs. Chuikov had a ration strength of approximately 30,500 men, backed by just 10 tanks. So even at this stage, the Germans still have the advantage in terms of the number of men in Stalingrad, at least when it comes to the ration strength. And the good news was that a March battalion of 914 men reinforced the 389th Infantry Division, this being a rare event on the German side, which is why I'm highlighting it. It's no wonder that Chuikov was worried that the Germans might be able to filter through his lines, because they were so thin. There was also a shortage of anti-tank weapons, and worse, the weather cleared up on the 21st, suggesting that the Germans would resume their attacks at any moment. Thus, it was critical that Chuikov received more reinforcements as soon as possible. Thankfully, Yeremenko now sent Chuikov the refitting 87th and 315th Rifle Divisions, although both of these remained on the eastern bank for the moment. Would Chuikov get them across in time before Paulus attacked again? Let's find out. Because the weather had improved, the Luftwaffe reappeared and dealt some substantial blows to the 62nd Army. German bombs wiped out the staff of the 141st Mortar Regiment and killed the commander of the 117th Guards Regiment. As the stalemate continued within the halls of the barricade factory and the nearby city blocks, outside the city there was a few changes to the Soviet order of battle. On the 21st of October, the Stavka ordered the 1st Guards Army to move its HQ and support organisations away from the Kotluban region, as they would be needed for the next major counter-attack, Operation Uranus. Then, on the 22nd of October, the Stavka ordered the 1st Guards Army headquarters to upgrade itself and form the Southwestern Front, commanded by Lieutenant General Nikolai Vatutin, which would act as the northern pincer of the operation. This would consist of the 5th Tank Army and the 63rd and 21st Armies, which would eventually be transferred to it on the 28th of October. The 8th Cavalry Corps, 1 Rifle Division and 5 artillery regiments were also transferred to the front as well, and it was hoped that Vatutin's front would be ready by the 31st of October. At the same time, the Stavka renamed the 4th Tank Army since it was no longer a tank army. At least in part, the Stavka's decision to rename 4th Tank Army was the result of the army's embarrassing lack of tanks. In fact, the army's chief of staff, Colonel I.S. Glebov, had sarcastically nicknamed 4th Tank Army the 4 Tank Army because, after losing several hundred tanks during its defeat in the Great Bend of the Don in August and in the Kletskaya bridgehead in September, by mid-October the army fielded only 4 tanks, all of which were being employed to protect the army's headquarters. So the 4th Tank Army became the 65th Army, with Kryuchenkin being replaced by Batov, former deputy commander of the Bryansk front. The army was also withdrawn from the area near the Don and took over the Kremenskaya bridgehead area. Meanwhile, the 4th Kotluban operation ground on, with Stuka strikes smashing the 66th Army's divisions. The only divisions to advance at all were the 62nd and 212th Rifle Divisions, who both crawled forward a short distance before being halted by heavy resistance. The other formations basically did nothing. The enemy's diversionary attacks against the positions of our forces north of Stalingrad were repelled with the support of German and Romanian aircraft. However, the 3rd Motorized Division was in a dire state by this point. One company was down to just 8 men, and there were only 30 panzers in the 103rd Panzer Battalion, many of which were needing repair. Back in the city, 51st Army Corps remained on the defensive on this day, with only local attacks occurring. Still, the Germans did plan to launch another attack the next morning, aiming for the Bread Factory and the Red October Factory, with the 14th Panzer and 79th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 24th Panzer and 305th Infantry Divisions, which would clear out the Barricade Factory and the bank of the Volga. Considering the state of the German divisions, this was going to be a difficult task. 79th Infantry Division had Kampfgruppen with as many as 2,500 men in each, whereas the other units couldn't even manage 1,000 men in their Kampfgruppen. Seilitz's forces therefore had around 10,000 men, while Churikov's men guarding the Bani Ravine to the Red October factory had fewer than 5,000 men, and there were another 2,500 men north of there. Paulus and Seilitz still had hopes for success, but both were concerned by the strength of their forces. Early on the 23rd of October, Lenski's Panzer Division fielded only 15 tanks, including 2 command tanks, but no Panzer II or Panzer IV short barrel models whatsoever. Surprisingly, the number of Russian auxiliaries in many of Seilitz's divisions, Hiwis, which were above and beyond the division's ration strength, outnumbered the division's German infantrymen and panzer grenadiers. Another rare March battalion reinforced the 305th Infantry Division, but the few reinforcements given to the units in Stalingrad just seemed to evaporate. Worse, German soldiers were weakened by a poor diet consisting of dry black bread, canned meat, and dried vegetables. Diseases like jaundice and hepatitis also ravaged the Germans, meaning that the troops they actually had in the field were physically weaker than they otherwise would have been. The same applies on the Soviet side, where the men were complaining of poor food supplies, assuming that they got any at all. Here, they do not eat. They perish from hunger rather than bullets. Churikov's army was on the brink, so as the 23rd of October rolled in, Rokossovsky was obliged to continue his attack in order to support him. Rokossovsky once again threw his divisions into the meat grinder, and unsurprisingly, the attacks were a failure, with the 62nd, 212th and 252nd Rifle Divisions being the only units to make any progress. The 212th Rifle Division, for example, advanced an entire kilometre, but again was halted. The OKW reported that the diversionary attacks by insignificant enemy forces in the northern part of the city were repelled. The 6th Army's diary also described the Soviet attack as having been launched with weak forces, so it's no wonder that on the same day Hitler remarked that the Red Army was in no position to mount a major attack at this time. And why would he not conclude this? The Soviets have continued to throw their soldiers at the Kotluban region for basically no gains, at the remarkably little cost to the Germans holding the line. Yes, it did tie down the 14th Panzer and 8th Army Corps and hurt the divisions in them, but the price for the Soviets had been substantially higher, so there was a definite trade-off here. Although in hindsight we know he was mistaken, at the time Hitler had judged the situation correctly. The Soviets were not in a position to mount a major attack, and the previous 4 attacks, the last one ongoing, had been dismal failures. From the German point of view, it genuinely seemed like the Soviets weren't able to launch a major attack. But in reality, the Soviets were gearing up once more. By this point, it appears that the overall plan for Operation Uranus had been solidified, even though there were minor changes going forward. On the 23rd, the Stavka also ordered the creation of 2 new armies, the 1st and 2nd Guards armies. These would form the spearheads of the coming offensives, although only 1st Guards Army would be ready in time for Operation Uranus. 2nd Guards Army was planned to be used for Operation Saturn. And Seilitz was about to launch another attack on the 23rd. Could it break through the Soviet lines once more? Would it bring Paulus another step closer to his ultimate goal, the conquest of Stalingrad? Or would Churikov's tattered army hold the line? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.